The first grave was found by accident. Tom Anderson's dog had gotten loose again, slipping through a gap in the fence and bolting straight into Mr. Thompson's backyard. When Tom went to get him, his foot sank into the ground. Soft, uneven, freshly dug. He bent down, brushing away the loose dirt, and that's when he saw it. A hand. Small, frail, bone-white. Tom screamed. The police were called. They dug up the body. It wasn't human. It was a dog. The Andersons' missing retriever. And it wasn't alone. They found 5 other carcasses, all buried in the yard. Some fresh, some just bones. And when they asked Mr. Thompson about it, all he said was, they weren't supposed to find those. Like he was talking about lost keys. Like it was nothing. George Thompson had lived on Maple Street longer than anyone. The quiet old man at the end of the cul-de-sac. First, he was just a friendly neighbor. Always fixing things. Always waving. Then his wife died. And things changed. First, it was small things. His once perfect lawn grew wild and tangled. He stopped talking to people. If you waved, he wouldn't wave back. He just sat on his porch, staring. Then the smell came. Thick, rotten, wet. People whispered about garbage piling up. Or maybe something had died under the house. But nobody asked him about it. Because by then, nobody wanted to talk to Mr. Thompson. Then the noises started. At first, it was construction sounds. The low hum of a saw. The slow, deliberate knock of a hammer. Always late at night. Always alone. Then the sounds changed. Muffled scraping. The rhythmic drag of something heavy. And worst of all, the knocking. Slow. Deliberate. Not on our doors. Not on our windows. But from inside his house. Like someone trapped in the walls trying to get out. Then came the lights. They appeared just after midnight. A dim glow in his basement window, moving, flickering. One night, Emily Rogers swore she saw something else. A shape, tall, thin, standing in the window, not moving, just watching. She ran home without looking back. One day, the police showed up. Some neighbor must have called them, maybe about the smell, maybe about the dead dogs. They knocked, waited, no answer. Then, just as one officer reached for his radio, the door creaked open. A few inches. No lights inside. Just darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, Mr. Thompson stood. Not speaking. Not moving. Just breathing. The officers asked their questions. He didn't answer. They asked again. Go home, he finally muttered. And then he shut the door. The cops never came back. And after that, the whispers started. Because if the police weren't going to stop him, who would? And then the pets started disappearing. First, it was the strays. Then, one by one, people's pets vanished. The Callahan's German Shepherd. The Johnson's Orange Tabby. Gone. Posters went up. Search parties were formed. Nobody found a single trace. And Mr. Thompson? He never asked about it. Never offered to help look. Never said a word. Just sat on his porch watching. One night, Emily Rogers saw him digging in his yard. It was past midnight. The street was silent. First, she thought he was planting something, until she saw him drag something into the hole. Something wrapped in a tarp. Something that looked heavy. She didn't say anything. But the next morning, when people looked out at Mr. Thompson's yard, there was a fresh mound of dirt. But no hole. No shovel. Nothing. Just a grave that nobody questioned. Then, one morning, something happened that nobody could explain. Emily Rogers woke up screaming. Her parents ran to her room, thinking she was having a nightmare. But she wasn't, because on the inside of her window, there were handprints. Not from fingers pressed against the glass. From inside the house. Long streaks, as if something had dragged its fingers down the entire length of the window. Emily swore up and down that her window had been locked, that nobody had gotten in. But those prints were real. And when her dad went outside to check for footprints, there weren't any, just dead leaves and silence. By the time November came, we were all living in a state of quiet fear. Nobody talked about it. Nobody dared. But we all felt it. Maple Street was not the same. Not anymore. Something was wrong. Something had changed. And deep down, we all knew it was because of Mr. Thompson. Because whatever he had started doing in that house, whatever he was building, hiding, keeping, it wasn't done yet. After they found the graves in Mr. Thompson's yard, people should have called for another investigation. They should have demanded answers. But they didn't, because Maple Street wasn't the kind of place where you cause problems. People whispered. They avoided his house. They kept their pets inside. But nobody did anything. Until the thing in the gutter. It was a week after the bodies were found. A storm had passed through, flooding the streets with mud and broken branches. The next morning, Jeff Callahan was outside clearing his driveway when he saw something jammed in the storm drain. First, he thought it was a plastic bag. But when he got closer, he saw the fur. Wet, tangled, dark brown. He grabbed a rake and pulled it free, and immediately dropped it. It was a leg. Just a leg. Ripped off clean. No other bones. No body. Just a single severed limb, waterlogged and half-decayed. It wasn't from a dog. It was too small. Too thin. Like it had belonged to a cat. People wanted to believe it was a freak accident. That maybe an animal had been hit by a car. That maybe the storm had washed it in from somewhere else. But then, they found more. 2 days later, Mrs. Callahan was out back when she saw something strange in the grass near the fence. First, she thought it was a rabbit. It wasn't. It was the head of a raccoon. Only the head. No body. The eyes were still open. And something had peeled the skin back. Not like an animal had done it. Like someone had cut it open carefully. Like they had studied it. She dropped it and ran inside. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't report it. Because by then, everyone already knew. There was only one person on Maple Street who could have done it. Then the bones started appearing. Little piles of them, left on people's porches. Perfectly cleaned. Perfectly arranged. First, it was small things. Bird bones. Tiny jawbones from rabbits. Then it was bigger. A spinal column from something larger. The jawbone of a dog, still lined with teeth. One by one, each house on Maple Street found something. But not everyone said anything. Because the people who spoke up, the ones who complained, the ones who looked too close, got something worse. Like the Mitchells. They had just moved in that summer. Didn't know about Mr. Thompson. Didn't know about the graves. Their dog went missing in late November. They searched for days. Left flyers on every doorstep. Then, one morning, Mrs. Mitchell found something in the mailbox. A Ziploc bag. Sealed shut. Inside, curled up and perfectly still, was the dog's tongue. Nothing else. Just the tongue. Cleanly cut. No blood. No note. No explanation. Just a message. And that night, the Mitchells stopped asking questions. It wasn't just animals anymore. Something else was happening inside Mr. Thompson's house. Because now, at night, when the wind blew just right, you could hear something from inside. Not voices. Not footsteps. But something wet. Something being peeled. Slow. Deliberate. The neighbors heard it. But nobody went to check. Because they already knew. And no one wanted to know what would be next. By December, Maple Street was different. The Christmas lights people usually hung up. Barely anyone bothered that year. The decorations? Faded. Sparse. Because by then, people weren't thinking about the holidays. They were thinking about Mr. Thompson. And what the hell he was doing inside that house. Nobody had seen him in weeks. Not outside. Not even getting groceries. But at night, his basement light was always on. Flickering. Moving. Like someone was pacing. At first, people joked that he was building something. Maybe he's got a damn woodshop in there, my dad muttered once. But then, people started hearing it. And we all knew. It wasn't woodworking. The first time I noticed it, I was up late doing homework. The house was silent. Then, through the thin winter air, I heard something low and wet. Not talking. Not mumbling. Just a sound. Like something being pulled apart. Long drawn out. Then, a thud. Something falling onto concrete. I shut my bedroom window and never opened it again. The last person to confront Mr. Thompson was old Bill Carter. He had lived on Maple Street longer than anyone. a retired army vet, tough as hell. One afternoon, he stomped up to Mr. Thompson's porch and banged on the door. Hard. Loud. "Thompson! Open up! Damn it!" Nothing. Not even movement inside. Bill stepped back, hands on his hips. Then he muttered something under his breath and, to everyone's horror, walked around back. No one ever did that. No one ever went near his yard. But Bill did. And when he came back around the front, his face was white. He didn't say a word. Didn't talk to anyone for the rest of the day. That night, he packed up his car and drove to his son's house 3 states away. And he never came back. Then, one night, the screaming started. At first, we thought it was an animal. Maybe a fox. Maybe something caught in a trap. But then it kept going. Long, strangled. And worse, it was coming from inside his house. It lasted almost 5 minutes. And then, silence. The next morning, Mr. Thompson's front door was wide open. Nobody went inside. Nobody called the cops. Because the police had already been here twice before. And nothing ever happened. But we all looked. And for the first time in weeks we saw him. Standing in his front window. Watching. His face was thinner. His skin paler. Like he hadn't seen the sun in months. And just as I turned away, I swear to God, he smiled. After that, people started talking about leaving. Not everyone. Not yet. But a few neighbors. The Callahans, the Rogers, the Mitchells. Were getting nervous. They called the city. Asked if they could do something about the smell. City workers came out that week. Checked the drains, the sewer lines. When they got to Mr. Thompson's house, they knocked once. Waited. Knocked again. Nothing. Finally, they went into his backyard to check the pipes. And when they came back out, they left. Quickly. Didn't say a word. Didn't file a report. Just packed up their tools and drove away. And that's when I knew. It wasn't just us. Whatever was happening here, even the city didn't want to touch it. And then the worst thing happened. On the morning of December 14th, Emily Rogers' parents woke up to find her bed empty. Her window wide open. Snow drifted in across the floor. They searched everywhere. The whole street helped. But she was gone. Completely. And when the cops came, they did nothing. Because there were no signs of forced entry. No footprints. No evidence. Just a silent, empty bedroom. And an open window. That night nobody slept. Because we all knew deep down, we weren't dealing with something normal anymore. And no one wanted to admit where Emily had gone. But we all knew whose house to check first. The night Emily disappeared, nobody slept. I could see it from my window. Lights on in every house. Parents standing at doors, whispering. Everyone was waiting. Waiting for someone to say it. To admit what we all knew. That she was inside Mr. Thompson's house. And someone had to go in and get her. The cops searched, of course. For a few hours. They knocked on doors. Drove through the neighborhood with flashlights. And then, they left. That's when the neighbors made a decision. Bill Carter was gone. The police were useless. It was up to us now. So that night, people grabbed their flashlights, their crowbars, their baseball bats, and they went in. They waited until 2 a.m. Until everything was still. Then they crossed the street, cut through the side yard, and went up the back steps of Mr. Thompson's house. Nobody knocked. Nobody called out his name. Because they weren't there to talk. They were there to end this. And if they found Emily inside, they were ready to do whatever it took. The door was unlocked. It swung open easily, revealing the dark kitchen inside. Everything smelled wet. The air was thick, humid, rotten. Like something had been soaking in the heat for too long. Someone gagged. Another whispered, "Keep moving." And one by one they stepped inside. The house was worse than we imagined. The walls were filthy, covered in stains that had soaked deep into the wood. The floor was sticky, every step making an awful, peeling sound. They moved through the kitchen into the hallway. Everything was quiet, too quiet, like the house itself was waiting. They found the first door, locked, so they kicked it open. Inside was nothing, just an old, dusty room. A chair, a a single flickering lamp. But the air smelled even worse here, and on the floor was a bucket, a deep, metal bucket. One of them knelt down, holding their flashlight over it. At first, they thought it was filled with water. But then they saw the color, and the smell hit them all at once. Someone swore under their breath. Someone else gagged. The bucket was filled with blood, and inside was hair, wet, tangled, floating just beneath the surface. They backed away fast. They wanted to run. They should have. But they didn't, because there was still one place left to check. The basement. The door to the basement was wide open. At the bottom of the steps, the light was flickering, moving, like it had been waiting for them. Nobody spoke. They just descended, one step at a time, and when they reached the bottom, they found her. Emily was standing against the far wall, her back pressed against it, her feet bare, her face blank. She didn't even look up, didn't react, just stood there. And between her and the group was Mr. Thompson. The old man turned slowly. His clothes were filthy, his hands were wet, and in one of them he held something sharp. A knife, a long, thin knife. His eyes were wide, unblinking, like he hadn't slept in days. For a long time nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then finally, one of them stepped forward, and in the calmest voice they could manage, they said, "What did you do?" Mr. Thompson didn't answer. He just stood there, still, silent. Then, after a long moment, he tilted his head, and he said almost casually, "It wasn't me." Nobody knew what happened next. There were too many voices, too many screams. Someone lunged for Emily. Someone else swung a bat at Mr. Thompson. And in the chaos, the basement light went out. Everything went black. There was shoving, footsteps, the sound of something breaking, and when the power flickered back on, Mr. Thompson was gone. The neighbors grabbed Emily, pulled her up the stairs, through the house, out the door, and they ran. They didn't stop until they were in the middle of the street, gasping for air. And when they turned back, Mr. Thompson's front door was wide open, but his house was empty. Emily wouldn't talk. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. She just stared at the ground. And when people asked her, over and over, "What happened? What did he do to you?" she only said one thing, over and over. He wasn't alone. Mr. Thompson was gone, disappeared into the night. The police searched for days, but it didn't matter. No tracks, no signs of where he went. His house sat empty, silent, and Maple Street felt wrong, like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Because even though he was gone, everyone knew it wasn't over. Nobody went near his house, not even the cops. They did one quick walkthrough and then locked it up. Nobody asked questions. Nobody wanted to know what was inside. But 1 week later, the city sent workers to clean it out. The neighbors watched from their windows, saw the workers step onto the porch, unlock the front door, and hesitate. One of them gagged. The smell was still there, still soaked into the walls. The workers put on masks and went inside. And less than an hour later, they came running out, faces white, hands shaking, and one of them pulled out his phone to call the cops, because they had found something worse than anyone had imagined. The police locked the street down. Nobody was allowed near the house, not until they had dug it up. And when they did, they finally understood. Because underneath the house, beneath the floorboards, they found another basement, a hidden crawlspace sealed off years ago. And inside were the remains. Not one, not two, at least 14 bodies. Some fresh, some so old that the bones had yellowed. But that wasn't the worst part, because some of them had been arranged, carefully, deliberately, like someone had been keeping them, like someone had been studying them. And in the very back of the space against the cold concrete wall, they found something else, a wooden chair, and a set of restraints, still bolted to the ground. The news spread fast. TV stations, online articles. Everyone wanted to know, who were the victims? How long had they been there? But nobody had an answer. Because not all of the bodies were human. Some were animal remains, pets, strays, anything he could get his hands on. But at least 4 of them were people. And 2 of them were never identified. Not by the cops. Not by anyone. Like they had never existed. Maple Street was never the same. People left. Not all at once. But slowly, one by one. The Mitchells were the first to go. Then the Callahans. Then the Johnsons. By the end of the year, almost everyone had moved. Too many questions. Too many things they couldn't explain. And too many nights spent wondering, where is Mr. Thompson now? The house sat empty for years. Rotting. Crumbling. Nobody bought it. Nobody even tried. Until one day the city tore it down. Nothing was built in its place. No one wanted to live there. No one wanted to risk it. And now, where Mr. Thompson's house once stood, is just an empty lot. Overgrown. Forgotten. But sometimes, when people drive by late at night, they swear they see something. A figure. Standing in the grass. Watching. Waiting. For someone to come back.